Good evening. I apologize for my laptop. I left my iPad at home, so I'm not hiding behind it, I promise. Welcome, thank you for joining us. Ocean Vuong and I will be in conversation for around about an hour, and then we'll go to audience questions. Ocean, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome. I just realized it's the 11th of September. I don't know if that date still has a lot of, well, of course it does have resonance for you. Were you in, because you studied in New York, didn't you? Were you in New York at that time?
No, I was but a wee lad, as they say, in these parts.
I forget I'm old.
I believe I was about 12 years old in middle school, but you never forget that morning, yeah.
So are you going to read for us to start?
Sure,
yeah, would you like to introduce the Emperor of Gladness,
right.
the Emperor of Gladness, and read a little bit?
Well, thank you so much for talking, and thank you for your own work, which I can't wait to dive into. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a deep pleasure to come back to this city, but to also the Southbank Centre. I felt like my career began here with the lovely forward prizes as a poet. It feels like a dream that I'm waiting to wake up from. But I want to also thank my publisher, Jonathan Cape, and the team who, there's one name on the book, but it's really a cohort of people. And it takes a tremendous amount of faith to publish a book. And I'm just deeply grateful. And also my Buddhist mentor, Tai Fapho, is here as well. So thank you so much for the presence here and for believing in what I'm trying to do. I'll read a little bit and then we'll have a conversation. This book takes place in 2009, mostly because I'm a very slow thinker. So if you want my Trump novel, you'll have to wait 16 years if we're here for it. But it was a time when we were experiencing the opioid epidemic without knowing that that's what it was. And so we were losing members of our community in a kind of plague. They were dropping overnight. And so that sort of horror haunts much of this book. The first person I saw OD was somebody's dad. He was 12 and had gone over to this girl Jennifer Knoxley's house to do a project for history class. They were in the living room cutting construction paper when her father came in very quietly, as if a ghost was wheeling him in, and sat down on the couch. After a while, his head tilted back and his mouth hung open, eyes rolled into their sockets. He looked like somebody had pressed pause at the peak of him laughing at the greatest joke he'd ever heard. This was the image imprinted on Hai's mind when he signed in at the New Hope Recovery Center. Every generation says this of itself, but these were indeed bewildering times he lived in. A time before iPhones were everywhere and people still looked up as they walked, their heads filled with self-generated thoughts floating from deep pits in the subconscious. A time when you still knocked on each other's doors, and if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to call them, listen to their mother's breathing for a while, maybe the sound of her fixing a drink or shaving her legs, then meet up somewhere, one of you waiting about, shifting your feet and looking at clouds or trees or municipal architecture, cars passing, your dopamine levels higher for not having been depleted from blue light screens throughout the day. A time when the drug dealer on the corner would, out of boredom, start balancing on the chain-link fence, the boy in him unable to help it, pants sagging from the effort, revealing his plaid boxers you can spot from the back window of your school bus. But then, slowly, 1 or 2 or 7 of your friends will find the pills, and they will fill their young brains with artificial joy. And you will join them running through the woods by the power plant, laughing at the immense night, your head levitating a full foot over your shoulders. And their eventual deaths will not yet be used by politicians to gain traction with the base. It did not have a name, the slaughter. And yet your loved ones were being slowly erased, even teachers and lunch ladies overdosing overnight. though it was never his drug of choice. He was barely 16 the first time he did heroin. One summer night at a skate park on the outskirts of town, he sat huddled among 3 other skater boys in the valley of a half-pipe, the candle flame still in the humid air as the spoon sizzled over it, Fugazi's waiting room running on a loop from a stereo in someone's Jansport. The boys had removed their socks, turning their long, bony feet in the light, searching for a good vein. They preferred the feet because it was easier to hide the scars. Plus, they could feel the speed of the hot, acidic rush literally surge through their legs to the tip of their heads, some of them tracing the drug's ascent with their fingers as if pointing to ruined cities on a map. But the sensation for high was more like drowning in his own blood, his neck craning to get above the tide. Soon there was laughter everywhere in the dark, hands slapping bare skin. But a half hour later, the only sound left was Fugazi playing over their gleaming, shirtless chests, mouths gasping like shored fish as fireflies flittered over them in the greenish night. Rehab, if nothing else, was a place to store yourself for a while. It was also, he quickly learned, a kingdom of boredom. You wait around until whatever poison that's ruining you empties into the world as time. Then you fill that emptiness with more time, talking, walking around the rec room, talking some more, painting watercolors of zoo animals, reading YA or science fiction, the only genres allowed. And after all that waiting, you stand by the barred windows and watch the golden arches from the McDonald's across the parking lot light up, which means it's time for the nurses to switch shifts for the night. And an alcoholic with Down syndrome named Jordan is next to you, pointing out the window, shouting, "It's chicken tender time. It's chicken tender time. Hey guys, it's tender time." The rooms are named after various genus of squash grown in New England, a laminated drawing of each type pasted on the doors. High shared the kabocha room with a sex addict named Marlon, who was strapped to the bedpost with bungee cords to keep him from jerking off. He turned to High one night and said quizzically, "Hey man, I was wondering, how come I never see any Asians in rehab? I've been to like 5 of these joints and never seen one till now." "MSG," I said, feeling crazy. "MSG," I said, feeling crazy. "What?" Marlon's eyes widened in the blue wet dark. "Oh yeah, it absorbs all the poison. Why you think the government hates this stuff? They don't want you knowing the truth. Then all these places will be out of business. They make a big fuss about how it's bad for you, right? Anytime the feds say something's bad for you, eat as much of it as you can." "Holy shit," Marlon said and sat up. "It won't work for your stuff, though." "Yeah, no, I get that. But what about you? You couldn't absorb all your MSG or something?" "I was adopted. Ate mostly waffles my whole life, and now I'm fucked." "Damn, dude." Marlon lay silent all night, this new knowledge burrowing through him, his straps clinking on the bedposts as he tossed about.
I'm really glad that you read that part out. Not only is it sort of hilariously funny, it really, for me, encapsulates my idea of the book as a whole being about grief and almost the grief industrial complex, if you like. All the main characters in the book are grieving. High, his late lover; Sony, his father; Glatzina, perhaps her hinterland. I feel like in Western societies, we've forgotten how to deal with grief, or to accept death as a part of life, because the West defines itself rationally in isolation from the community wisdom of non-Western societies. We have this over-reliance on pharmaceuticals to deal with the collateral of grief, which perpetuates new and insidious patterns of grief and trauma response, including addiction. How do we rescue ourselves from that cycle?
Gosh, that's the million-dollar question, huh?
Sorry.
But I think so much of I hesitate myself to use West just because there's so much to it, and there's so many layers. Having just come from Italy, like Italians are like, and when you read, widely, as we both have in the European tradition, it's hard after a while to say that something is Eurocentric, because I think often what they mean is like Western military dominant European countries that has then had cultural prowess. Whereas like in some parts of Italy, some works, or some parts of Scandinavia, the work is actually very nebulous and strange. So I can only speak as an American, and I think everything you said is very true in America. And I think pharmaceuticals are so vital because, in a way, it creates a kind of hallucination. Pleasure is a kind of hallucination. And I think in this way, America itself is so interested and so invested in having a dream, the American dream. You never hear about the Vietnamese dream or the Nigerian dream or even the Belgian dream. I'd like to know what that is.
Well, the Belgian dream, the UK left in 2016.
But I think when you look...
Not me getting a round of applause.
But I think when you look at it, America is actually really dependent on its dream because to wake up would be too costly. To wake up to a country that is founded on indigenous genocide and slavery is so painful as to kind of undo the very sense of a legitimate nation full of patriotism, goodwill, altruism, righteousness and virtue, all these things that the founding fathers were purported to possess and instill, and yet they owned slaves. When George Washington's teeth fell out, he used the teeth of his enslaved peoples. So one comes to reckon right away that history itself is fiction. It lies through omission. It tells facts and then it leaves out other facts. And it's part of this propagandic myth that we live in. And so I think that's why the dream is so important to the American project, because as soon as that evaporates, it must contend with the truth, and it's impossible to stand on the grounds that it's built up as it is now with those truths, which is why Make America Great Again is so intoxicatingly powerful. It's such a seductive term because it performs memory, but it's actually amnesia via nostalgia. Because when you ask, where is that again, you'll never find a timeline, at least not a consistent one. I live in a very rural part of Massachusetts, in a town of 30,000 people. And so I meet a lot of Trump voters, and you have to. They become someone who, you hire a plumber, someone comes wearing the MAGA hat, and you have to kind of engage. And it's interesting that throughout the years, in the past 10 years or so, I've asked folks from age 17 to 20 to 30, all the way to 70, where was America great again for you? And a really fascinating thing happens. 90% of the time, they describe the years prior to becoming teenagers. So if they're very young, it's like 2004. America was perfect for them in 2004. During the Bush era. And for some folks, it's, the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, when we were, killing babies in Vietnam. But what was revealed then was that it was deeply psychological and full of pathos. And as a writer, I said, oh, now we're in my territory. We're really talking about emotion. The three classical Greek modes of argument, ethos, logos, and pathos, unfortunately, we evolved to only respond to pathos. No matter how many numbers of people die from COVID, how many inches of the sea level, it'll never really sink in until you hear a story about it. And this is, politicians then use it. I know, I was just in Chicago, and there's a plumber named Joe. 3 kids, he's out of job, and he's thinking about how he's going to pay the mortgage, right? So the framing of this, and I tell my students this, I was like, the culture shames you for being a poet and a writer, saying you're navel-gazing, you're doing this kind of nebulous, self-involved work, this sort of grand, decadent work. But the people who run the country to the ground or run for power use the same modes. And so I think it's kind of everywhere. But at the heart of it is a politician coming to these communities that have been economically blighted and saying, I will restore your childhood. And that is the most American thing. It's the Bildungsroman, it's the Bildungs, it's the bell jar, it's Catcher in the Rye. It's this idea that you can restore youth if you control the population, if you just cleanse it enough, isolate, kick enough people out, you will restore the promise of your youth. It was deeply edifying for me to look at this and ask myself, how do I make literature out of it?
Thank you. Hai and Grazina, the sort of two main characters in The Emperor of Gladness, they're around 60 years apart in age. They come from, at least superficially, geopolitically different backgrounds. But they form a deep bond after Grazina saves Hai from, spoiler alert, literally jumping off a bridge. Both of them live in the shadow of war and famine, and both, in a way, survive through disassociation, which perhaps is a big part of why they understand each other so well. They both feel, in some ways, their family's disappointment. I felt like you were sort of writing a critique of the care industry. We have, I guess, similar kind of issues in both the UK and the US in terms of, how do we care for our loved ones as they age, and who gets to sort of make decisions on whose behalf. So can you talk a little bit about where that theme came from to lead the book?
Well, in America especially, care, which I think is such a fundamental part of being alive. Forget about like constitutional rights or what have you, but just the idea that a community is held together by the awareness of suffering and the attempt to ameliorate it, and yet it is so expensive, right? Care is no longer just this abstract thing that we talk about, I care for you. It's an industry, healthcare, the care industry. And, I lived with an elderly woman to get through to college, so I had experience caretaking someone with dementia. But when I was going to marketing school, for all but
we all have our dark pasts. Every writer you speak to has a skeleton.
The Death Star was within reach.
Mine was an engineering degree.
Oh, Lord. At least they're structurally sound things. I'm afraid,
I don't know about that.
I'm afraid I was heading into another mirage of deception. But I took a computer class, and a mandatory computer class, and the project was either program something using HTML, which, Lord help me, that
Lost
was
already.
Never going to happen, or mercifully volunteer at a nursing home to help the elderly use the computer.
I would have done the same as you.
So I was like, I have no choice. This is the only thing I'm going to do. And it was really funny because we grew up so poor. I did not have a computer until just the year before I'm teaching this class, right? And I had a old big Mac that was, the one that was translucent. and you can see into its organs, right? And watch how slow it worked. But then
See, that's my 2004.
So I was put in front of this black Dell in the middle of a hallway, and I was trying to help someone's poor, lovely grandmother open an email account. Why they thought opening an email account would help heal anybody. But this was 2008. We had a hopeful, if not ambivalent, relationship with email. But immediately there was a crisis because the mouse was on like 300 speed. And for the life of me, I did not know how to get it to slow down. And it was also so small.
It was dreaming, like rapid eye movement.
So it's me and this poor lady. I'm like, it vanished. It just keeps vanishing. She's like, where did it go? How does it go? And I said, well, there it is. And then I had to flag down a nurse, and then she saved us. But I went back every week, and what I noticed, this was the lead up to the Obama presidency. And there's these folks who are in their 70s and 80s, and I'm talking like they just got like major surgery for cancer, broken hips. It's a rehab center for the elderly. And you would think folks like that would be really bitter about the world, about being outside of it while it was burgeoning towards this political crest. And yet they were so deeply invested in it. And when we open up the news, they would start telling me about the Reagan era and what they've been through. And they were just so sincerely devoted to the health of the country. And I think I started to realize that they actually wanted the country to be restored so that when they come back to it, they come back to a better place. And I think I just really wanted to capture that sort of very deliberate determination in this book from what I've witnessed with the elderly.
We were talking a little bit earlier about Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's exactly the promise that they're given as well, that they will return, if they die, they will return to a paradise earth, but in their youth.
Right.
They'll return as their younger selves.
Wow.
So
is there an age limit to that? What is it? Yeah. I'm just curious. Like, is it like 12?
I don't know. I mean, because like some people sort of, are late bloomers.
Right.
So if you come back when you're sort of like, not at your best, but you're like, 17.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would be cute or not.
15-year-old
I think I'd rather
me
sort
would
of,
be rough.
come back when I'd sort of become a beautiful swan. I'm thinking of Gaza when I recall the James Baldwin quote, "Every bombed village is my hometown." Many of the characters are defined by their proximity to war, the memory of suffering or heroism. Some are free to celebrate the legacy of victory, while others have to watch their suffering used as entertainment. And I think of the scene towards the end of the book where Hai and Sony are watching American films about the Vietnam War. Yeah. I thought it was a very interesting depiction of the immigrant experience, in that to be American is to side with the oppressor, essentially. The American dream is a settler colonialist dream. I'm sure Frantz Fanon wrote something about this directly, and I've never been able to find the quote. But can you talk a little bit about that history and how you were able to extrapolate it through these characters?
Oh, thank you for that. It was a lovely reading. War haunts this book, but it's not like a war book. But I wanted to haunt the book in the way it haunts America. The fantasy of the revolution. Again, George Washington is this progeny of light, a savior, a divine presence, literally, in many instances in how he's depicted. And so the fetishization of a country founded on war, but not mentioning the genocide of indigenous folks, the attempted genocide, the stolen bodies through the Middle Passage. But if one tries to, it's also through the mundane, right? If one tries to rent an apartment in America, you're confronted with a lexicon of war. Oh, this is a post-war revival apartment, right? This is a pre-war, a red brick build. And this is an antebellum ranch, right? You mean a former plantation, right? And so I think war is embedded into the imagination. We also measure ourselves through war. These are the post-war writers. We measure our art movements through war, art after Vietnam, art after 9/11 and the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the Civil War leading to naturalism, moving from romanticism to naturalism. So violence is literally how we measure time in America. Time is literally how you start to think about epochs, which war, and then lineages of grandfathers and fathers who fought in which wars. And it's a rallying cry because it's the myth of the nation is to always fight for its quote-unquote freedom. And the freedom is very conveniently abstracted. And I remember, talking about mythology and fiction in everyday life. I remember as a kid growing up in the Iraq wars in 2003 and 2004, you would see classmates, and if they're in fatigues, it wasn't like they're doing ROTC or training, they're going to war. And a lot of them were working class, poor, brown and black folks in the community that had no choice. And this it's a story as old as Rome, right? You use folks who are deeply maligned economically to fight for the rich. But there was a commercial that I first saw for the Marines. And it was a commercial of a Marine in ceremony garb with a sword, right? Which has no function in modern warfare. But not only that, he walks up to a cliff and literally slays a dragon. A very poor CGI 2003 dragon.
I was going to say literally.
And this was also the time of Lord of the Rings, right? And so you can see that the myth is that this is a holy and righteous and virtuous army. And again, going back to Make America Great Again, restoring youth and the pathos of it, we're telling these young people that to bomb another country is to restore this kind of dignity and respect for yourself and your community by slaying evil. And most of these, you never see a single Black Hawk helicopter in those commercials, right? Roland Barthes writes beautifully about this in his work, Signs and Mythologies. And so to me, that has been such a deeply woven part of American civic life, war and Christianity. I believe it was Terry Eagleton, who I read again and again, such a wonderful British thinker, who clocks it really well, where he says America might be one of the only nations in the West who still depends on Christianity to dictate its civic life, where a lot of other Western countries have kind of shifted away from that. But it's almost impossible for an American politician to not swear allegiance to God and country before taking political office.
Well, that's a great point. I've never thought about that actually, how European nations seem to be much more secular and to keep apart the state from the church. I've thought about it a lot actually, but you mentioned your reading. I was very interested to see in the acknowledgements you talk about Mark Fisher's book on hauntology. I've not read much of it yet, but seeing it there reminded me to devote some time to it. I came across the term in a YouTube video like a year ago about the idea of a future that our society has been robbed of through advances in technology. which might sound like a contradiction, but we're not yet at the point of flying cars and jetpacks. And indeed, the most profound effect that technology has had on our society has been to make us more self-absorbed in a way, and to bombard us so that we're permanently reactive. We rely on images from the past in order to feel a sense of the future and explain the present. And I wanted to sort of ask you about time, because it's such an important, you've mentioned it already, but it's an important theme in all of your work. Your previous poetry collection was called Time is a Mother. And in this novel in particular, time seems to fracture, and the characters are able to sort of surf through the fissures in time in order to ground themselves in a present, which I guess is analogous to the theme of Alzheimer's as well in the novel. There's a question there somewhere, I don't know what it is necessarily, but maybe just tell us a little bit about how your studies in hauntology and other ologies maybe have developed in your fiction.
Well, I'm deeply interested in theory. I think, I tell my students this, even if you don't read the fancy philosophers or what have you, just have a theory for your work. To me, theory is the soil, and the work are the flowers that come through. If you don't take care of the soil, the flowers won't flourish. And if you're just obsessed with having flowers, you might as well plant fake flowers down, right? And then they slowly fade and with the sun and they're gone. But if you have good theory, and it could just be a theory for language, for yourself, maybe you're against the letter E, as George Perec was, then go at it, but have a North Star. And then even when you're not trying, the flowers will bloom. I live in a rural place. I'm surrounded by farmers. Most of our friends are farmers. And they can tell you it's about the soil. The soil is 90% of the work. Everything else is if your soil's good, things will come up even when you don't want it to. The work starts to become more effortless. And so I'm deeply interested in how thinking and philosophy affects action. And there's so much, from Benjamin to Hannah Arendt to Eastern philosophies of Lao Tzu, Buddhist phenomenology. But Fisher's work, borrowing from Derrida, he comes up with this idea of the 21st century being haunted by the 20th. He said there's no such thing as the 21st century. It's only the 20th century in high def. And he sadly took his own life in 2014, and we're really curious to see what he would think today. He comes from this kind of post-punk aesthetic. He comes up with this really brilliant idea that really made me understand what my youth was going through. He calls it reflexive impotence. He says that the youth generation have opted out of progress as method, not because they're tired or lazy, not because they are uninterested, but they have seen that the system is rigged, that no matter what they do, no matter what job they get, they won't be able to pay rent, they won't be able to support themselves, live their dreams. So reflexive impotence is a refusal of opting into that American dream, that system of linear progress. And he says that we are kind of affected by the lost futures that technology promised. The Enlightenment from that moment now was supposed to free us from agriculture, but it only freed white men. Agriculture and labor was then exported through colonialism to the global south and then harvested and plundered. It was all that beautiful engineering and technology led us to what? Mustard gas, the trench wars, gas chambers, industrial revolution, which then led to the abuse of labor. It led us to the technologies now that are stripping our dopamine, leading to highest suicide rates we've known thus far. So we've been robbed of this promise that the elites, right, people who own these companies have always had this altruistic, futuristic humanist endeavor, but it was always this bait and switch. We were bought in, and then we were robbed on the outset. And he frames it so brilliantly, both in Ghosts of My Life and also in Capitalist Realism. And so I constantly look to those folks to help me think through. And fiction becomes a kind of staging ground where a lot of these things can be animated through pathos. I don't believe, and I apologize ahead of time if this offends anyone, but I don't believe literature is itself a virtuous act. I don't believe books are itself a virtuous act. The left, particularly the upper middle class left, often starts to see itself as curators or protectors of culture through engagement in literary arts. But it's important to remind us that, Pol Pot read Rimbaud and Verlaine. To what end? There's people who, are starving the children in Gaza now who celebrate art and make films and write books. After they ran the gas chambers, they went home and listened to Wagner and Rilke, read Rilke to each other, right? The Third Reich began with a book. And also poets can be captured. You think of Lord Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade, which all that beauty, all those sonics, that learning, that Victorian rhythm leading to what? Legitimizing a war to serve, again, the elites, to instill patriotism. Think of Virgil, either coerced or forced by Augustus Caesar to write this beautiful epic, the Aeneid, for what? To legitimize a crumbling Roman Empire. And again and again, we see poets, again, I have a very vexed relationship with the poet laureate position or the inaugural poet. I've been asked during the Biden administration many times to go and crown or legitimize that office with my work, and I can never bring myself to do it. Because historically, the word is just like anything else. It's a strategy around pathos, and it could be used to destroy, or it could be used to illuminate. And I don't want to presume that my work is innately virtuous. I have to keep myself on my toes. I also don't want to presume that I am somehow more intelligent than my reader. I think if I approach the white page assuming I know more than my reader, then that's where my creativity starts to wither. I don't know if you had a question, and then I don't know if I answered it.
I'm just enjoying listening to you speak.
I have this mental illness where I speak in paragraphs. And my students like it, but I promise you, it is horrifying for my family, especially after midnight.
If that's your mental illness, I'll have what she's having. I'm just going to press on. You've written a critique of the food industry in this book, particularly the fast food industry and its endless ephemera and environmental impact. I feel like you and I have a lot in common, actually, because I worked in McDonald's when I was a teenager.
You?
I did, yeah.
Bless your heart.
We also, I know. Side point, but we were also, I don't know if you remember this, but we were in an issue of Fantastic Man magazine together.
Yes.
Yeah, back in 2021.
Yeah.
Back when I was famous. So anyway, fast food industry. Samuel R. Delaney was also in that magazine. That's claim to fame. Fast food industry, its endless ephemera and environmental impact. I was never called upon to slaughter live pigs, as Hai was. But what I enjoyed most about this strand was the way your characters found each other and became family. Simply by way of them being in the same place at the same time for long enough. Bearing witness to addiction, to sickness, to lost dreams. They're all sort of going through or helping someone through some kind of trauma. And I feel like there's a lot of love between them in what is, of course, an uncaring world. What made you decide to situate, a substantial part of the story in that space?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, when I was learning how to be a novelist, I read the books people told me to read, and I was deeply frustrated because I started to realize that everything was around ideas of catharsis. The 3-plot, 5-plot system often that prevailed. It's important for me to say prevailed, not composed, because there's a lot of diverse composing in the West even. But what prevails in the West is this strategy, this narratology towards catharsis, which rags to riches, the girl gets the guy, guy gets the girl, find the body at the end, there's like that Scooby-Doo effect. I don't know if you have that cartoon here.
Of course.
But before the episode starts, you know there will be an unmasking, right? And so there's a kind of commercial promise that is a lot like fast food, right? You go to a Marvel movie, you know how it's going to kind of go, right? There will be a battle, good will somehow prevail, even if troubled by, something else looming over, which will then appear in the next movie, right? So there's kind of this endless trope. And when I started to ask, like, why? Why transformation and change and catharsis was so important to so much of our culture, I realized that it kind of ameliorates a lot of the realities of being stuck. That's so much of modern life is about, from the Industrial Revolution onward, which started in this country. The first worker strike, the first labor strike happened here, and it was the humble terry cloth makers who did it. And so from there, I think there's this beautiful kind of burgeoning catalog of working class fiction, of course D.H. Lawrence, but also Barry Hines, A Kestrel in a Nave, which led to the Ken Loach film Kes, which was one of, I think, my top 3 favorite films. That film especially gave me the permission to not have catharsis, to not have a happy ending, the way that film ended. I think the story behind that film was that Disney wanted to buy it, but they had to make it a happy ending. And Barry Hines so beautifully, in a dignified way, refused that and worked with the BBC to do it. But when I dove into it, I realized that this is actually a deeply political narratology. Plato famously banished the poets from his republic because he was afraid. His republic, his ideal republic, is actually the same size as the town I live in, which is 30,000 people. So in a republic of 30,000 people, he thought that poets would cripple the guardian class, the military class, with emotion. So God forbid your soldiers feel too much, they would lose the validity of their work, and the republic would fail. And who would be in trouble if the republic falls? The aristocracy, which Plato was part of, most likely slave owning, although there's no smoking gun. So he wanted the poets to be banned. He hated poesis. He preferred mathematics because a square is a square is a square, 4 right angles. It will never change, but there's no equivalent to the square for poetry. He called it shadow work. But his student Aristotle, which we credit the Poetics and this narratology from, was much more even-keeled. He said it's not feasible to constantly exile every generation of writers. You would lose the republic. So why not coerce them to create this narratology that would ameliorate the vexation of the public, like draining an abscess, seasonally. They can see a play, use deus ex machina, alleviate their discontent for the state into story, and then absolve it and keep draining this pus and keep the republic intact. And from there you have the Roman Colosseum, you have Marvel, you have the Super Bowl, you have boxing.
It's just starting to sound like an Adam Curtis documentary.
And the thing is, I'm not saying that's bad. In fact, I don't even think Aristotle's ideal worked, right? I don't think that mode worked as a civilizing mechanism. You think of Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. For all the faults of that novel, using that catharsis, it led to the liberation of enslaved people, right, in America. So in a way, some things have been the opposite effect from Aristotle's dream. But I just thought, gosh, such a dominant mode of narratology was founded on civic control. What happens if we develop a mode of storytelling, I don't know, that prioritizes wonder, civic bewilderment, charm, joy, curiosity, right? So there's a militant narratology that has been so dominant in our culture. Is there anything else? And in my quest to look, I mean, I read all these other narratologies from India, East Asia, and I stumbled upon Wong Kar-wai. When talking about In the Mood for Love, he said, I want transformation without change. And that reframed how I saw that film. I said, of course, they are trapped. That couple never solves that vexation. It's all love without answers. And that apartment becomes this claustrophobic tornado in a jar. And then I thought, I said, because I'm a poet, I said, isn't that what the sonnet is? One of the most innovative forms in Anglophonic poetry, from Petrarch to Shakespeare to Gwendolyn Brooks to Bernadette Mayer to Ben Lerner. The sonnet is a form, 14 lines, volta at the 10th or 12th, that actually behaves like a cage. The innovation happens inward, the dynamism happens inward. And I thought, isn't that what America is? Isn't it to be an American, to be trapped in a free country? We're told we have two choices. We have to vote one way or another. Our tax money gets funneled into pharmaceutical companies or weapons companies. We end up bombing children or bombing entire countries we never have any say in. And so there's this kind of trap. The fast food restaurant is also a sonnet. It's a square box where you're stuck and you have to innovate. You have to look at the characters and the people in there and get through the shift. You have to get to that volta by looking at each other and working inward. And I thought, that's what I want. I don't want catharsis. I want to find a way to use the sonnet as a literary narrative device to tell storytelling. And it allowed me to give me the courage to refuse that kind of absolving the reader. I think often there's kind of two products to a book. There's the text itself with the ISBN, and then there's that Scooby-Doo promise. I'm going to ameliorate this tension. And it felt very phallic, and at times phallic, heteronormative even.
Okay.
Everything is about this releasing. And I think I'm more interested in literary edging.
Okay.
It's worth a shot, right? It's worth a shot.
Well, I'd say mic drop, but that's phallic too.
But is it worth the money shot?
So the Emperor of Gladness, following on from Time is Mother, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, you're dealing with very sort of deep and dark subjects. But I found, particularly in this book, that there's some relief there. You use a lot of dad jokes, which I love. I love a dad joke. There's camp aesthetics in there. There's a light, often sentimental tone that can sometimes, lull the reader into a sense of security that you then disrupt with a moment of trauma. I think you've alluded today as well in speaking, there are many sort of history lessons in the book, but depending on who is kind of delivering them, they might be unreliable, like the MSG quote from earlier. Can you speak on the voices and the main voice, the voices? I don't know. of the narrative? Because there do seem to be different sort of registers and intentions there. And that's the question. And then I just want to say that I, as a reader, appreciated being trusted. And it made me think that you felt safe and to be vulnerable. And so could you speak a little bit on that?
Oh, thank you so much. That's such a generous reading. I believe in a kind of seeing drag, literary drag or what have you, as a kind of praxis that is very liberating. And I've never believed in the idea of style. I think that gets too close to brands, which then needs to be either replicated or protected, or both, which then stunts growth.
Another cage.
Yes, and so another cage, another expectation. And I think style is something you already have. It's distinct, but when you try to do it, you actually start to deny it. And to me, style is closer to desire. It's about asking the questions that are inexhaustible and using every tool at your disposal to move towards it. And in all of my books, I think of everyone as like a drag performance. I'm going to wear all this type of clothes and approach the subject this way. In the next book, I'll throw all this out and do a whole nother set from a different angle. I want to almost forget it. And yeah, there is a distinction. People much smarter than I can find it. But I trust in that. There's a kind of idiosyncrasy. I do think syntax is DNA to a certain extent. But in this book, it was a deliberate kind of approaching it from a different set of tools, a different set of tone, mostly because my books were getting banned. In Russia, they were being challenged in Vietnam. They're censored, huge chunks of them are censored out in China. They asked me to rewrite parts. I will never rewrite my work for any publisher or any market. But I did not want to deny potential queer readers in China. So, the book is amputated and cut up in that market. I'm being banned and challenged in my own country, in the South. I knew that my words were going to be censored, but I did not want my ideas to be censored. And so I wrote my serious artist statement book on Earth, serious in tone, letter to a mother, to a son. It's hard to have humor there because the urgency of that premise was so tight, right? Here's everything you need to know as soon as you can, if you ever can. In this book, I was inspired by Miyazaki's films, and particularly Studio Ghibli films. Miyazaki is really deeply interesting to me because he developed a very charming aesthetic, a very warm, light aesthetic to write about the most brutal things. Ecological destruction, war, consumerism, existential crisis, the loss of morality, everything that post-World War II, post-fascist Japan was confronting on how to resolve itself, particularly for the younger generation. And so it became this kind of brilliant Trojan horse. And I thought, gosh, I never saw fiction borrowing from animation to kind of upset its very serious highbrow tones, except very incidentally in a lot of Steinbeck's work, Cannery Row, Catcher in the Rye, Carson McCullers. For some reason, those novels appear as animations to me. I see Holden Caulfield as an animation, and also with The Heart as a Lonely Hunter. And I thought, can I borrow, just for this book? I don't think it's something I'm interested in doing for other books. But again, I did the artist statement one. You can never write on Earth again, nor should you. And here I wanted to be inspired by this maker in Miyazaki in using a kind of soft vignette in order to talk about the most brutal and harrowing things, hopefully to allow my works to survive in communities where poor queer kids really need it, and there are literal demons stripping their right to read it in these towns and these public libraries. I think they're going to ban it anyway, but that was, at least the inspiration around the tone that you're clocking.
I have many more questions, but I'm sure you do too. Do you mind if we
please
transition
Yeah.
to audience questions? We do have a couple of roving mics available. So yeah, I will invite questions. Oh my goodness, look at you.
Oh,
I can see you now.
let me see if the outfits are cute. Oh yeah.
What do you want to do? Do you want to, because I feel like you're a very spiritual person, so I think you probably want to pick your own interlocutor.
Oh gosh, I can't pick. You gotta pick.
Oh really?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Well, I can't see. So there's someone in white in the second row. You're standing in front of that person, so I couldn't see them. But let's do both. Let's do both.
Spiritual, because my question was on that. It seems to me that your work is an instrument or a meditation practice of some sort, that the goal or the outcome isn't the literary work, but more it's a stepping stone toward illumination in some way or form. Would that be right, or does it sing right with your own inner desiring or spiritual journeying or path?
Yes, absolutely. And but I also would expand on that and say I'm skeptical if that it's even possible to write, particularly literature, for art's sake, right? I think in the West we have this fantasy that the genius is a self-arising, independent entity, that the author does not. The greatest kind of like achievement for an author is to like not be associated with their life or even like a physical body. Certainly not to be inspired by an autobiographical life. And I'm skeptical of that because I think in the same way that a lot of Western natural preservation projects also deny the human body, right? It's always about restoring nature to its pristine, unhuman position, and it fails to see that we are part of nature. We have to actually, in order to preserve it well, we have to consider our presence in it. But the fantasy of the naturalistic 19th century painting that's pristine and virginal, right, is also part of so much of art making. That again, when Homer began the Odyssey, there's a metaphysical moment where he prays, he supplicates to the muses to help him, right? Inspiration from the Greek is to be breathed into, to be chosen. Likewise, Milton, right? I shall convey the ways of God to man. Milton saw himself as a conduit. It's hard to say if Milton saw himself as writing literature or was he writing theology as a divine oracle, right? The idea of literature is still a very nascent one. Shakespeare certainly would not have considered what he did literature in the way we see it in an English department. For Chaucer, literature was anything that was written down. So I think it's helpful to think on that question by interrogating what is literary art, what is literary production, and to put a little pressure on it as this thing that exists away from the populace. And I think that's where we can think through a lot of the complications of ideas of greatness, which is fetishized in the West, right? And there's a historic reason for that, right? The European nations started to build their own canon because they were in competition with each other. And so every single one started to develop its visual art canon, its literary canon, and then it was used as an ideology to suppress the working poor of their own, and then extort that and then export it to the global South as an ideology of power. We see this in the work of Derek Walcott, Kamal Brathwaite, V.S. Naipaul, for all his complications, wrote brilliantly about that. And so I'm skeptical that anyone, even look at the work of like Robert Walser, this sort of strange, unique German-speaking writer who wrote on tiny scripts, right? but a deep interiority. His work went on to inspire Frank O'Hara and Eileen Miles, the New York School, Ashbery. That is not without its politics as well, especially him living most of his life in insane asylums, right? What does it mean to have your body regimented in that way? What does it do to your syntax, your imagination? Why did he write in such minuscule script? What does that say about his personhood? There's so many readings and hermeneutic projects to all of this. And I think it's helpful to kind of put a little suspicion on that. Because out of the Enlightenment, we started to see greatness as something that the populace cannot reach. You have great art, it must be moved into a museum, put behind glass, you must charge the public. And so the further away from humanity, the closer to greatness. This follows true to the divine myth. The closer to God, the closer to greatness, right? And so I think it's important to kind of put pressure on what is literature, what is it for, how does it function? And I believe it always has a function. And this is true with how the canon is arranged, right? For example, the Romantic poets were deeply political poets, but you would hardly note that in an American English department. They are taught as kind of these, effeminate chasers of the divine, sublime seekers who full of eros and amorous love poems that were beholden to nature. But in fact, they were responding to the Industrial Revolution. It was a political act, right? These folks moved to the countryside, trying to find a medicinal linguistic answer to what they saw was total decimation of the burgeoning working class. So, in short, ideology is much closer than we often think. And I think a writer is a maker of ideologies. The question is, to what end? And I think every writer has an end, whether they are truly aware of it or not.
Thank you, Ocean, and thank you for your question. And we'll go to the person next.
Hi, Ocean. I loved On Earth, We're Briefly Gorgeous, one of my favorite books. I think about the eye being a lonely creature metaphor at least once a week. My question was on self-censorship. You talked about censoring your work because it's getting banned in a lot of countries. And I wanted to ask what your advice would be to a writer on self-censorship, especially in the current kind of political landscape.
Yeah, that's a great, beautiful question. The caveat is that I kind of did what I wanted without censorship in my first book. This, I wouldn't say so much that this second novel is self-censorship so much as trying to use a restraint, similar to the sonnet. The sonnet is innovated through restraint. But that's only because I got to do what I wanted in my first novel. So they're very dependent on each other. I could not or might not even be interested in writing The Emperor as a debut. But with that said, that's me personally. With that said, I always like to think that we should maneuver deftly so that we can do our work the next day. And a lot of that has to do with strategy, right? A lot of that has to do with surviving through the storm. Even if it means moments of silence, waiting for censorship and fascism to quell, or to rather work to distinguish it or extinguish it, rather than, I know it sounds really great to say write whatever you want, but historically that has led to actual writers dying. And on a smaller scale, even for me in academia, right, I'm troubled by it. It has historically excluded people of color, working people. I'm the first in my generation, in my family, to ever step into a university as a professor. But for me, I have one foot in, one foot out. I don't believe in its sort of authority. Hannah Arendt very wonderfully dismantles the idea of authority and power into two focalizing points. And she says, power is mobile. One could take power. We can storm a police station, and for the few hours that we're there, we will take that power until it's taken away. We can occupy spaces and take power. But we do not have authority. Right? Authority for Arendt comes through temporal reification, decades of giving power and reification to ideas like the crown or a presidency, the Oval Office, a police department, right? And so I think for me, I try to do the work with suspicion of the authority. I know that it's not legitimate. You know, I work at NYU, but to me it's a building where I get to work with students across the world trying to make stories. But if I walk in there believing that I am bestowed by NYU and therefore I am somehow superior because of it, is the death of my work, right? So it's all internal, because at the end of the day, it looks like somebody going to work at an institution. But inside that, you can start to trouble it, subvert it, and wobble it, because you don't have a dogmatic allegiance to it in the same way that someone else who grown up with that authority, believing in that authority. So for me, it's about doing and troubling the work just enough so that you're allowed to do it again the next day, because in the long run, you can do more good that way. I say this as a 36-year-old who's taught only for 11 years. I think I've given myself permission that if it gets too dark, I would leave it. You know, I'm not beholden to myself to that place, but now it's an experiment. To me, everything is an experiment. The sentence in it is an experiment. The classroom, this whole thing is about trying. You know, I love the word essay from the French l'essayer. I think inside every work of art is the essay, which is to try. And I think that is true too with maneuvering around censorship. Do it, but do it so that you can survive, so that you can keep doing it.
Thank you, Ocean. Thank you very much again for that question. And we can take one more. So I think we're going to go to this side. We'll go to the person in, is it, I can't see, but is it green you're wearing? It is? That wasn't shade. Why are you laughing?
Hi. In terms of kind of your writing, you began as a, I guess, quote-unquote poet with Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and then you moved to the short piece in, I can never remember the name, it's On Fire Escapes in the anthology, and then moving on to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and now with this. Do you feel like there's a transition in how you write from sort of poetry to long-form content?
I think there's always a transition. That's a lovely question. But I think the genres are porous for me. This comes from a Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, the body is not as stable as it seems. It's more like a fountain. It's just constantly a system of change that is, it gives an illusion of stability. And I think genre is similar. I could have began as a novelist as well. I was more interested in poetry because I wanted to see the sentence as a site of flux, of change, of possibility. I wanted to see if the line could be pushed into something new. And I think early on, I didn't have the courage to stay in prose because I was told that good prose should be lucid and inconspicuous and only serve the story, right? This comes mostly from the 20th century after Stein and Hemingway. The 19th century prose was very different. But that was kind of the note du jour. And so you have a sentence like, he walked into the room, pulled out the chair and sat down. Fine sentence, lucid, inconspicuous. But when I wrote that sentence, I just felt like it wasn't mine. It came from elsewhere. It came from the culture. It came from the magazines, the news. Like it just wasn't idiosyncratic enough. And I think that's why I turned to poetry, because after, because the greatest anxiety for the poet, which I think my long answer is that every writer should try poetry, whether earnestly or just for fun. Just try it, because the greatest anxiety for the poet, the lyric poet, is, am I gonna write a block of prose that I'm gonna then lineate, right? And that is a very useful anxiety, because no poet wants to be perceived as, I wrote a block of prose and then press tab. So
We've all done it.
With that anxiety, you start to ask more of your line. And when you ask more of your line, you ask more of your sentence, and you ask more of that, you ask more of the sonics and the syntax. So now there's more of you. And so poetry became a great laboratory for me to kind of go towards that quest. But it has its limitations, right? I think I wanted to borrow the temporal duration of the novel to follow characters and ideas through time. And that is something the lyric poem couldn't do. The lyric poem is like a guitar solo. It's all good, but it shouldn't go on for an hour. And so I wanted to challenge myself and bring the poiesis that I learned. Because prose, is obsessed with mimesis, replicating life. I don't think it necessarily should just do that, but that's kind of how it functions in the 20th century. But poetry is poiesis, so I'm trying to bring poiesis into mimesis in the novel. But the novel allowed me to think through my characters and allowed me to have an accountability to time and physics, right? What are the repercussions of actions, and what does that mean through months and weeks and years? And so the novel became a wonderfully capacious form for that. But I don't have an allegiance to genre in any way. To me, they're very porous and at best wobbly. Thank you. May I say one last thing? If you indulge me a moment, I'd just like to end with a little song. I warn you, I'm no singer, but having grown up, unfortunately, with a lot of my friends overdosing and dying from the epidemic, I went to a lot of wakes, and there was this one song that we would sing a lot at these wakes and these funerals of these teenagers that were our friends. And it's an old Appalachian hymn called Bright Morning Stars. And I always sing it to myself because I feel like in the midst of all that horror, there was a kind of optimism to this little psalm. And my country is in a lot of trouble right now. I think maybe all countries are. I don't know, and I don't know the half of it. But if you would indulge me, I'd just like to close with this Appalachian hymn that I've carried in me for so long, and I just want to give it in this very feeble, cumbersome instrument that is my voice. But thank you so much. Bright morning stars are rising. Bright morning stars are rising. Bright morning stars are rising. Day is a breaking in my soul. Oh, where are our dear mothers? Oh, where are our dear mothers? They have gone up to heaven, shouting in my soul. Day is a breaking in my soul. Thank you.